Welcome to History Beyond Sleep, where we uncover the secrets the textbooks tried to hide.
In the still hush of twilight, centuries before our present time, Christianity lived not in stone cathedrals or gilded texts, but in shadows. Not yet a pillar of empire or a tool of kings, it breathed quietly in hidden homes, desert caves, and candlelit gatherings where memory was the gospel and love was the only creed. The year is uncertain. Perhaps the late 1st century, perhaps the 2nd. Rome rules with iron certainty, yet beneath the surface a whisper spreads. The followers of the Way, as they called it, carried a message that felt too soft for empire, too strange for pagans, and too dangerous for politics. It was not yet won. Faith, but many flickering flames, each telling the story of a man named Jesus Rabbi, mystic, miracle worker, or divine mystery, depending on whom you asked. They did not agree. Not yet. Some saw Jesus as a divine being who merely wore a human shell, like a traveler passing through this earthly fog. Others saw him as a man chosen by God, a vessel of cosmic wisdom. Still others spoke of him as the embodiment of Sophia, divine wisdom herself come not to die, but to awaken. Dozens of gospels drifted across the ancient world. The Gospel of Thomas, shimmering with riddles and inner knowing. The Gospel of Mary, in which a woman speaks boldly of spiritual ascent and liberation from the body. The Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocalypse of Peter. Each held a key, a fragment, a reflection of something greater. None yet claimed to be the truth, only a truth. Faith in these early days was a language of dreams, not dogma. There were no fixed doctrines, no councils, no creeds to recite. Followers debated kindly in quiet corners, wondering whether Jesus had truly died or merely transcended, whether his teachings were meant to liberate the soul or the body, whether salvation came from his blood or from within. And yet, amid these differences, there was unity too. They broke bread. They prayed for peace. They comforted the dying. They washed one another's feet. These were people shaped more by persecution than by power. Rome had not yet embraced them. It hunted them. Nero had blamed them for the burning of the city. Martyrs died in amphitheaters, their prayers swallowed by the roar of lions and crowds. But persecution does something strange to belief. It makes it radiant. It sharpens the edges of compassion and softens the need for control. For a time, the early followers were content with mystery. And then, slowly, the world began to change. By the late 2nd century, leaders emerged, not emperors, but bishops. Men who organized gatherings, defined boundaries, chose which texts to read and which to ignore. Small communities started asking big questions. Which gospel is true? Which letters are sacred? Who speaks for the faith? The age of fluidity was drawing to a close. A new concern crept in heresy. A Greek word meaning choice, but it quickly took on a darker meaning. Deviation, division, danger. Where once differences had been embraced, now they were feared. The writings of people like Valentinus, who spoke of hidden spiritual realms and the feminine face of the divine, were labeled false beautiful, yes, but dangerous. Power was beginning to notice Christianity, and when power notices belief, it rarely leaves it untouched. But in this moment, this ember before the fire, we find something rare, a sacred wilderness, a garden of possibilities, a vision of Christ that does not yet belong to an empire, a chorus of voices, female and male, mystic and literalist, Jew and Gentile, all fumbling toward the light. They did not yet seek to control it. They only sought to understand in Rome, in Alexandria, in Antioch, in far-off Edessa Christians, gathered, argued, prayed. They passed letters and stories across the sands. They copied Gospels by hand, often adding notes in the margins, little reflections or reinterpretations. Scripture was not yet frozen. It breathed. No one yet stood above them all. No one said, "This is the one-way." It was a time of tension and tenderness, of confusion and courage. They believed something had happened, something world-changing, cosmic, unspeakable. But what it meant, and how to live it, was still being whispered in homes and hearts. These were the years before decisions hardened, before the Council of Nicaea codified the faith, before scrolls were banned and burned. These were the years when Christianity was still becoming, and while they may have lacked certainty, they held something far more rare. Wonder at the mystery of incarnation. Wonder at the nearness of divine things. Wonder at the possibility that salvation was not bought with blood, but with awakening. Tonight, as you rest beneath the weight of stars older than Rome, imagine these early gatherings, the quiet prayers, the fear and the hope. The pages passed, from hand to trembling hand, the courage to believe when belief had no reward. And remember, every great fire begins with an ember. Let us follow its glow. Softly. Long before sacred texts were bound in leather and locked behind altars, Christianity was a living breath, passed softly from voice to voice. In those earliest generations, words were not yet scripture. They were stories, fragile, changing, alive. A mother whispering to her child by firelight. A traveler recounting what he heard from another who had known a man who'd walked with Jesus. A fisherman repeating a parable, half remembered, half felt. There was no Bible, not yet. Only memory. The ancient world was built on the strength of the spoken word. Most people could not read, and even fewer could write. Parchment was costly. Ink was a treasure. A single scroll could take weeks to copy by hand, and many of the early Christians were poor, outcast, or wandering. Instead, their truth lived in retelling. And so the stories changed slightly, gently with each telling. Like a stream shifting its path across the years, the tale of Jesus moved, grew, diverged. His words were repeated with reverence, but also reimagined. Through new ears and new lands, among new needs. In Galilee, he was a teacher of wisdom. In Rome, a sacrifice for sins. In Egypt, a revealer of divine mysteries. In Syria, a cosmic figure from before time. Each community shaped him in its image, not out of deception but devotion. This was not yet distortion. It was devotion in motion. The first followers did not demand perfect harmony. They believed in the Spirit of Christ, not the letter. Some groups treasured the Gospel of Peter, with its vivid resurrection scenes. Others revered the sayings of Thomas, where Jesus offers not commands, but cones mystical riddles meant to awaken the soul. Still others, far from Jerusalem, cherished fragments of oral tradition that never reached parchment. Even Paul, whose letters now anchor Christian theology, did not imagine himself writing Scripture. He wrote urgently, passionately, to real people with real struggles, advising, comforting, sometimes correcting. His words were not yet canon. They were conversation, and the Gospels themselves, as we now know them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, did not appear all at once. Decades passed after Jesus' death before the first of them was written. Mark, the earliest, arrived around 70 A.D., almost a full generation after the crucifixion. Why did it take so long? Because at first they believed the world was ending. The first Christians were apocalyptic. They truly thought Jesus would return in their lifetime to usher in a kingdom of peace, justice, and divine presence. There was no need to write things down when the world was so near its transformation. But time passed. Eyewitnesses aged. Persecution grew. Memories began to blur. And so the writing began. Scribes sat in candlelit rooms, guided by fragments and faith. They gathered stories, sayings, visions. Sometimes they combined different traditions. Sometimes they added reflections of their own. The Gospel of Matthew, for example, was written for a Jewish audience, filled with references to Hebrew scripture and lineage. Luke wrote for Gentiles, smoothing the path between cultures. Each gospel was a lens. None was a photograph. But even as these writings emerged, they did not immediately replace the oral tradition. For many years both lived side by side, the written word and the spoken song. Still, something subtle began to shift. Words on parchment could be copied. They could be carried to distant lands. They could be preserved and controlled. A faith, once shaped by memory, began to crystallize in manuscript, and with manuscript came authority. Gradually, certain texts were favored, others ignored. Communities who followed gospels outside the emerging mainstream found themselves marginalized. Their voices, once equally valid, were now questioned. The spoken word, fluid, intimate, alive, began to give way to the written word, fixed, formal, final. But not all were ready to let go. Many clung to their ancestral gospels, the ones that stirred their hearts, the ones their grandmothers had recited with trembling lips. In Egypt, in Syria, in the deserts of Palestine, alternative Christianities flourished. Gnostic groups, mystical sects, and quiet communities of seekers held fast to their sacred texts, many of which were never welcomed into the growing canon. And so the divide began, not between truth and lies, but between versions of truth, between a church that was beginning to organize and those who found God in the margins. And yet, for all its conflicts, this was also a time of incredible creativity, a time when poetry met prophecy, when visionaries dreamed of Christ descending through layers of light, when Mary Magdalene taught that salvation meant transcending fear, when Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas whispered, "Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift the stone, and you will find me." Such was the richness of the unwritten faith. It was not yet an institution. It was a movement. It was a mystery. Tonight, as you lie still, think of those voices, not the loud ones in courts or cathedrals, but the quiet ones. The grandmother in Antioch telling her grandchildren of a gentle healer. The scribe in Alexandria writing by oil lamp, copying lines that might one day be burned. The child in Edessa humming a hymn her father heard from a traveler 2 decades ago. This was the early faith, unwritten, unfinished, unshackled. It may have lacked clarity, but it shimmered with soul. And as we drift onward toward councils and creeds, let us carry this memory with us, the sacred wilderness of a faith that lived first in whispers. The desert remembers what the world forgets. In the dry silence of Egypt's cliffs and sun-blanched caverns, something remarkable slumbered. For over 1,000 years, scrolls sealed in clay jars, untouched by light, untouched by law, words written in defiance, words buried in hope. They waited beneath the sand, patient, hidden, nearly lost. And then in 1945, near the sleepy town of Nag Hammadi, they were found by chance, by accident, by destiny, perhaps. A local farmer digging for fertilizer stumbled upon a trove of ancient papyrus codices, bound in leather, worn by time, wrapped in linen. He had no idea what he had uncovered, only that the scrolls were old and strange, and strangely powerful. It was the spark of rediscovery. What came to light was unlike anything in the known Bible. Here were gospels never seen in churches, teachings of Christ that had been silenced for centuries, visions, hymns, cosmologies, rich, mystical, bewildering. These were the Gnostic Gospels. They did not begin with genealogies or miracles. They began with mystery, with paradox, with poetry. These are the secret words which the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. So opens the Gospel of Thomas, one of the most haunting documents of the early Christian world. In it, Jesus does not heal the blind or walk on water. He offers riddles, teachings like whispers from another world. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. No creeds, no cross, no resurrection, instead awakening the divine within. A journey inward, not upward. These texts spoke of salvation not through belief, but through knowledge, gnosis, the Greek word for inner knowing. They claimed that Jesus came not to die for sins, but to reveal that the divine spark already lived within each of us. A dangerous idea in a world of bishops and empires. Other scrolls, too, whispered forgotten names. The Gospel of Philip, where Mary Magdalene is not merely a follower, but a companion, perhaps even Christ's equal. The Apocryphon of John, which tells of a cosmic creation far older and more complex than Genesis. The thunder, perfect mind, dazzling monologue from the divine feminine, both gentle and fearsome. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter. I am the silence that is incomprehensible. These were not fictions, nor forgeries. They were sacred texts revered by early Christians, and yet they were buried. Why? Because by the 4th century power was drawing lines, and Gnosticism, with its inner truths and many voices, did not fit neatly into empire. These Gospels taught that the material world was not holy, that the creator of the physical universe was not the ultimate God, but a lesser being, a flawed architect. They saw the true divine as unreachable by law or liturgy, not something to be worshipped, but remembered, reunited with. Such beliefs undermined hierarchy, undermined church, undermined control. And so these texts were condemned. In the year 367 A.D., a bishop named Athanasius issued a list of sacred books, 27 of them, the same ones we now find in the New Testament. All others were declared heresy. This was not a spiritual decision. It was a political one. Gnostic writings were rounded up, burned, erased. Communities who cherished them were scattered. Their scrolls, if not destroyed, were hidden away, buried in clay jars and tucked into caves, in hope that someday someone would listen again. And for 1,600 years, no one did until a farmer's shovel cracked the seal. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library was a rupture in Christian history, a window into a world long thought lost. These texts offered a different Christianity, one not defined by obedience or suffering, but by illumination. They were not easy. They were not safe. They spoke in symbols. They spoke in contradictions. They required thought, contemplation, dreaming, which is perhaps why they were feared, in the centuries after Nicaea. The Church moved to unify doctrine, to silence dissent, to draw hard lines between truth and error. There was little room for mystery, nuance, or poetic paradox. But these scrolls beneath the sand were not interested in permission. They were meant for seekers, for those who still asked questions, for those who felt the divine not only above, but within. And though many today still view them with suspicion, the Nag Hammadi texts have reshaped our understanding of early Christianity. They remind us that what we call heresy was once called Scripture by someone, that the path we walk was not inevitable, it was chosen, that there were other roads, wiser, stranger. We cannot say, but they were real, and once someone believed them sacred enough to risk their life for them, to write them, to copy them, to hide them beneath the desert floor. So tonight, as your thoughts slow and the dark becomes kind, imagine this: a monk in 4th century Egypt wrapping his scrolls in linen. He hears footsteps in the distance. He knows they are coming to destroy, and so by lamplight he seals his faith into clay and buries it deep. He does not know if anyone will find it, but he hopes. And you now are his answer. By the dawn of the 4th century, the quiet flickers of a scattered faith began to cast longer shadows across the empire. What was once whispered in catacombs and desert caves was stirring in the halls of power. The fragile mosaic of Christian beliefs was about to face its greatest trial, the embrace and control of imperial Rome. The Roman world was vast and ancient, its traditions deeply rooted in pagan temples, imperial cults, and diverse local gods. Yet beneath its sprawling order, unrest simmered. Soldiers, merchants, slaves, philosophers, millions sought meaning. In a time of uncertainty and change, Christianity, still a mosaic of sects and teachings, offered something new. A promise of eternal life, a community of love, and a vision of justice beyond earthly empires. But it was still fragmented, diverse, unruly. Emperors had tolerated it as a minor nuisance, even persecuted it ruthlessly, seeing it as a threat to the Roman way. Yet a new emperor emerged, Constantine, who saw something different in this faith. Perhaps it was political opportunity or a genuine vision. Whatever the cause, he would change everything. In 312 A.D., on the eve of a great battle, Constantine is said to have had a vision, a cross of light above the sun, with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether dream or divine message, it was a turning point. Soon after, Christianity went from outlaw to ally. But this alliance was not seamless. Christianity had no single voice, no single book, no single creed. It was a forest of beliefs, some mystical, some legalistic, some radical. If the emperor's vision was to unify his empire, Christianity had to unify itself first, and so began the preparation for the Council of Nicaea, convened in 325 A.D. here. Bishops from across the empire gathered in the ancient city of Nicaea, men of power and conviction, many with opposing views. They debated endlessly. What was the nature of Christ? Was he God, man, or both? Was he created or eternal? Was the Holy Spirit divine? Their words were heavy, their voices intense. The future of Christianity and empire was on the line. Yet, beneath these theological debates lay a deeper, more dangerous question. Which texts and teachings would survive? The council did not merely define belief. It defined authority. It drew a line between orthodoxy and heresy, between the approved and the forbidden, between light and shadow. It was here, in this charged atmosphere, that many of the alternative gospels and teachings were condemned and ordered to be destroyed. The scrolls of Gnostics, the voices of Mary Magdalene, the poetic riddles of Thomas, they were branded threats to unity and power. Burning these texts was more than censorship. It was a cleansing of memory, a shaping of history itself. To preserve unity, dissent was not just silenced, but erased. The Church, now intertwined with empire, wielded its newfound power to forge a single story. And yet, even as fires consumed books, whispers remained in hidden corners. Because truth, like water, finds cracks to seep through. Tonight, as your eyelids grow heavy and the world softens into shadow, imagine the flicker of those flames, not only consuming, but illuminating. The faith that emerged from Nicaea was no longer merely a movement of whispered stories. It was a church of empire. But somewhere, beneath the ashes, the forgotten voices still breathed. They waited for rediscovery, for reckoning, for dreams, the crackle of flames, the bitter scent of burning parchment. These are the echoes of history's darkest silences. When the Council of Nicaea drew lines between light and shadow, it was not only ideas that were lost, but entire worlds of thought, entire spiritual landscapes consumed by fire. But what truly dies when the written word is burned? Does the flame silence truth or merely veil it? Some scrolls turn to ash, yes, but the ideas, those fragile embers, kindled secret lives, whispered in hidden circles, passed hand to hand, heart to heart, like forbidden lullabies. Monks in remote monasteries copied fragments in secret, hiding them beneath false pages. Desert hermits memorized verses no one else dared speak aloud. Mothers sang forbidden hymns softly, in tongues that echoed ancient mysteries. The early churches, silence was not total. It was a quiet resistance. Within cloistered walls and wilderness caves, whispers of the banned teachings endured. The divine feminine, once honored in Gnostic circles, retreated into shadows. Mary Magdalene, no longer the bearer of sacred knowledge, became a figure of legend and scandal. Yet even in diminished form, her story lived on in secret rites and hidden prayers. The radical vision of salvation, as awakening gnosis became a quiet flame in the hearts of mystics. They spoke of inner light, of escaping the chains of the material world, of returning to a divine source beyond the empire's grasp. These were the silent flames, resistant, elusive, sacred. They shaped mystics and heretics, poets and seekers throughout the centuries. In the forests of Europe, in the deserts of Egypt, in the hills of Syria, those embers smoldered, waiting for new breath. And sometimes in the deepest quiet of night, they spark anew. Tonight, as the world softens and your mind drifts toward dreams, listen closely. Can you hear the faint murmur beneath the roar of history? The soft pulse of voices unforgotten? The silent flames still glowing beneath the ashes? They remind us, truth, even when hidden, is never fully lost. As the dust settled from the fires of Nicaea, a new canon took shape, the sacred texts that would guide a burgeoning church and empire. These scriptures, bound in leather and sanctified by decree, became the foundation of faith for millions to come. But what stories were chosen, and which were quietly set aside, whispered into oblivion? The four Gospels we now know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were deemed authoritative. Their accounts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection were woven together into a coherent narrative. They spoke of a Savior who was both human and divine, the Son of God who came to redeem humanity. Yet outside this chosen circle lay a labyrinth of texts, many vibrant, many profound, many dangerous to established power. The Gospel of Thomas, with its secret sayings, the Gospel of Mary, which elevated a woman to spiritual leadership, the Gospel of Judas, recast not as a traitor, but as an enlightened participant in a divine plan. These were cast as heresies, but beyond labels, these texts reveal a richness of early Christian thought that challenges our assumptions. They speak of a faith less concerned with dogma, more with personal transformation, mystery, and paradox. The canon did not emerge from divine clarity, but from human struggle, negotiations of power, fear and hope. As you lie here drifting softly toward sleep, imagine the hands that selected these texts. Not distant authorities, but real people, weary, passionate, flawed. They held ancient scrolls, weighing not only words, but futures. And as they closed some books forever, they opened others, creating a new spiritual map with both light and shadow. The stories left behind still linger, like ghosts in the quiet halls of history. They remind us that faith is not a fixed monument, but a living, breathing mystery. As the walls of orthodoxy rose higher, many early Christian communities found themselves cast out into the shadows, exiled from the emerging official faith. These were the seekers and mystics who embraced the forbidden scrolls, who found divinity in unexpected places, and whose voices were silenced but never extinguished. The Gnostics, with their belief in hidden knowledge and a divine spark within, were among the most hunted. They did not bow to imperial decrees nor accept a single centralized dogma. Instead, they explored the mysteries of existence in silence and secrecy. In distant deserts and forests, in secret meetings beneath stars, they passed down teachings meant to awaken the soul rather than command obedience. Their texts spoke in riddles and paradox, inviting believers to question reality itself. Mary Magdalene, a figure erased or maligned by official narratives, remained a central figure in many of these lost traditions. To some, she was the bearer of sacred wisdom, the apostle who truly understood Christ's message. These exiled voices preserved a vision of Christianity as a personal, transformative journey, not a rigid institution. Yet exile came with great peril. Followers risked persecution, imprisonment, even death. Their communities scattered, their scriptures hidden or destroyed. But their faith endured an undercurrent beneath the roaring tides of empire. Tonight, as you close your eyes and sink into sleep's gentle embrace, listen for their whispers. They speak not in thunder, but in soft sighs. They remind us that even in exile, the soul's quest for truth is unyielding and eternal. By the time the bishops gathered in Nicaea, the Christian world was a tapestry of tangled beliefs, none more divisive than the question at its very center: who truly was Jesus? To most believers, he was divine somehow, some way. But how he was divine and in what relation to God the Father was no small detail. It was a storm at the core of the soul, a question that would break churches, shatter friendships, and stir the first great theological war. At the center of this tempest stood Arius, a priest from Alexandria, a man of sharp mind and quiet conviction. He taught what to him seemed both reasonable and reverent, that Christ, the Son of God, was divine but not equal to the Father, that he had been created begotten in time, not co-eternal, not without beginning. There was a time, Arius whispered, when he was not. This, for Arius, did not diminish Jesus. It honored the mystery of God's transcendence. In Arius's vision, Christ was the highest of all creation, the radiant link between God and the world, but still created. Yet to others this was a dangerous fracture. Opponents like Athanasius, young and fervent, argued fiercely that Christ must be fully God, eternally God, that he was homoousios of the same substance as the Father, not merely like him. If Christ were anything less, then salvation was at risk, for only God could restore what had been broken. Their arguments were not just theological. They were visceral, because behind them lay an empire seeking unity. Constantine, now patron of the Church, wanted peace, not complexity. He could tolerate many things, but not division. And suddenly, this theological nuance became a political powder keg. The Council of Nicaea, in 325 A.D., would confront it. Over 300 bishops gathered, many bearing the scars of persecution, now sitting under imperial banners. A creed was proposed, clear, forceful, absolute, begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father. Arius refused, and with his refusal the line was drawn. A vote was taken. The majority sided with Athanasius's view. The Nicene Creed was ratified, and Arius was exiled. His writings were condemned. His name and time became synonymous with heresy. But ideas once spoken do not die easily. Arianism spread across the empire. Among soldiers, citizens, and even emperors, the idea that Christ was subordinate to the Father took root. Civil wars broke out. Bishops were deposed. Arius was briefly restored, then rejected again. The controversy would rage for decades far beyond Arius's life. Even after his death, he remained a ghost in the Church's conscience. Why did it matter so much? Because this was not merely a doctrinal disagreement. It was a struggle over the shape of God, the nature of salvation. The very identity of the Christian message. Was God a distant monad, unknowable and untouched, who sent forth a lesser being to redeem the world? Or was he present personally, intimately, in a man called Christ? To side with Arius was to preserve divine transcendence. To oppose them was to affirm divine intimacy. In the end, the Church chose the latter. The Creed of Nicaea would hold, but not because it silenced all opposition, rather because it had the backing of emperors, armies, and councils. Its truth was not only written in ink, but carved in power. Still, there is something poignant in Arius's voice, not because he was correct or incorrect, but because he reminds us that the earliest Christians were not afraid to wrestle with mystery, to ask, to doubt, to speak. His exile marks a turning point, the moment when disagreement became danger, when inquiry became rebellion, when theology became territory. And even now, as the world turns and time flows on, we still hear faint echoes of that ancient question: who was he? God from God or something else? Tonight, as the stars cast their quiet silver over the sleeping earth, let the question soften your thoughts, not to trouble you, but to remind you that once, long ago, people risked everything, not for certainty, but for the right to wonder. Once upon the shimmering edge of the Mediterranean stood a city built not just of stone and streets, but of knowledge. Alexandria, a jewel of the ancient world, where East met West and reason danced with revelation. It was a city of scrolls and stars, temples and scholars. Here, logic and mysticism were not enemies, but siblings. Pagans, Jews, and early Christians debated not with swords, but with ideas. At its heart stood the great library, a wonder of the ancient world. It was more than a building. It was a living archive of humanity's soul. Philosophical treatises, sacred writings, medical scrolls, astrological charts, histories, hymns, all gathered from the known world and preserved beneath one roof. It is said that the library housed up to 500,000 scrolls, some lost from history's memory, others never meant to survive at all. Among them were likely early Christian texts, some that echoed the New Testament, others that defied it. Writings that blurred the line between gospel and philosophy, between Jesus and mystery. The library did not discriminate. It collected truth, in all its forms, well-behaved or not. Here, the lines between Gnostic and Orthodox were still soft. Here, a Christian might read Plato, and a philosopher might ponder the teachings of Christ. The city was alive with ideas, but light, when it grows too bright, casts long shadows. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, tensions grew. As Christianity gained imperial favor, it no longer came only in sandals and whispers. It came cloaked in political authority. And in Alexandria, a city of fragile balance, that shift cracked the peace. Religious factions turned bitter. Philosophical schools were accused of heresy. Debates that once fueled growth began to spark fear. And then came the fires. The destruction of the great library of Alexandria is shrouded in mystery, because history, like parchment, burns unevenly. Some blame Julius Caesar, whose siege in 48 BCE may have scorched part of the collection. Others point to Christian mobs in the 4th century who, empowered by imperial decree, turned against pagan temples and anything associated with them. What we do know is this: knowledge was lost, scrolls were burned, shelves shattered, ideas fragile, irreplaceable rose in smoke. Among the casualties may have been gospels never included in the Christian canon, letters from mystics, commentary from early theologians, and perhaps texts that would have changed how we understand Christ, salvation, and the early church, but they were never seen again. Among the darkest chapters was the destruction of the Serapeum, a majestic temple dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis, which likely housed a branch of the library. In the late 4th century, it was ordered destroyed under the Christian Emperor Theodosius I. What followed was not only the collapse of a building, but the symbolic toppling of ancient knowledge itself, the scrolls, the gods, the philosophies reduced to rubble in the name of purity. Not long after, in 415 A.D., a woman named Hypatia, a brilliant philosopher, astronomer, and teacher, was murdered in the streets by a Christian mob. Her crime was not rebellion. It was knowledge, influence, dignity. With her death, the last flame of Alexandria's ancient intellectual spirit flickered and faded. And yet, even in that loss, something endured. Fragments of the library's works were copied by Arab scholars centuries later. Some escaped to Byzantium. Others traveled to Persia, hidden in satchels and hearts. Pieces of memory, scattered like ash on the wind. As for the Christian writings lost in Alexandria's fall, we can only imagine. Perhaps they spoke of a Jesus who taught inner freedom rather than outer obedience. Perhaps they preserved the voices of women disciples. Perhaps they questioned authority or invited the soul to awaken gently. We do not know, but their absence leaves a haunting silence, a blank space in the story of faith. Tonight, as you drift further into stillness, picture the halls of Alexandria, scroll-lined corridors, scholars murmuring in many tongues, the scratch of a reed pen on papyrus.now. Listen to the hush after the flames. Not to despair, but to remember that knowledge, like truth, is always vulnerable, always in need of protectors. And though smoke may carry words away, memory waits in the quiet, hoping to be found again. In the early days of the Christian story, the divine wore many faces, some male, some female, some neither at all. There was a time when the sacred feminine was not absent, not erased, but revered. She appeared in symbols and gospels now forgotten, and in the quiet devotion of those who saw God not only as Father, but as Mother, Womb, Wisdom, and Breath. Yet, as Christianity aligned itself with empire, something subtle and then not so subtle began to shift. She began to disappear. The church of the 1st century remembered women as apostles, teachers, and prophets. Mary Magdalene was not only the first witness to the resurrection, she was, in some communities, its most profound interpreter. Paul himself acknowledged female leaders. Eunia, Phoebe, Priscilla, names now rarely spoken from pulpits, but their influence echoed strongly in the Gospels that never made it into the canon. In the Gospel of Mary, Magdalene is portrayed not as a penitent sinner, but as a disciple among disciples, one who receives a vision from Christ that others could not comprehend. Peter, in that very Gospel, questions her authority. Levi defends her. Surely the Savior knew her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. Such words were radical then and now. They appended the hierarchy of the emerging church one, rapidly being built on male leadership, priesthood, and patriarchal inheritance. The Gospel of Philip goes further still. It calls Mary the companion of Christ, suggesting an intimacy that transcended ordinary discipleship. It speaks of a sacred union, not just physical, but spiritual, a partnership of balance, of masculine and feminine coexisting within the divine. These ideas were dangerous, not because they lacked truth, but because they disrupted power. In many early Christian sects, especially the Gnostics, Sophia, the embodiment of divine wisdom, held central place. She was not metaphor, she was cosmic. She was the bridge between heaven and matter, the ache of separation, the spark of return. To them, salvation was not only about sin and redemption, it was a return to wholeness, a reuniting of the fragmented soul with its divine origin, and the feminine was essential to that return. But as the institutional church grew in structure and ambition, it carved God into simpler forms. The Holy Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, became standard. Masculine titles solidified, and the divine feminine began to fade, tucked behind curtains or recast in silence. Mary Magdalene, once honored, was rebranded. In 591 A.D., Pope Gregory I identified her as the sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet, a mistake of interpretation that reshaped her story for over 1,000 years. She became the repentant prostitute, the emblem of forgiven sin, not sacred wisdom. Her legacy, once luminous with vision, became cloaked in shame. And yet she never disappeared. In secret, she remained a figure of mystery. In medieval mystic writings, she flickered back into view silent, robed, radiant. In hidden traditions, she survived as priestess, prophetess, beloved. In art, she stood at the foot of the cross, unflinching. In the thunder, perfect mind, a text found in the Nag Hammadi library, the voice of the divine speaks in paradox. I am the mother of my father, the sister of my husband, the barren one. With many children, it is a voice that breaks boundaries, that refuses confinement, that carries echoes of a time when God was not so easily defined, when the divine moved in cycles and wounds, in wind and word. Some traditions believe the sacred feminine was never lost, only veiled, that she waits not in distant heaven, but deep within the soul, in dreams, in intuition, in silence. Even in Orthodox Christianity, small traces remain. The Holy Spirit in ancient Syriac texts is spoken of as feminine. The wisdom literature of Proverbs describes her as dancing at creation's edge. She was with God in the beginning. The sages say she has always been here. And now, in our time, the veil begins to lift again. Scholars revisit the lost Gospels. Artists reclaim the forgotten symbols. Seekers listen for voices long silenced. The sacred feminine returns, not as a rebellion, but as a remembering. As you lie beneath the quiet of the night, let your mind rest in this deeper truth, that the divine is not limited to power or decree, that God may speak in softness, in nurture, in balance, that holiness may appear not only as thunder on a mountain, but as a mother's touch, a healer's hand, a whisper at the tomb. She never left. We only forgot how to see her. And now, in stillness, we begin to remember. In the cool twilight of the ancient world, a man named Constantine stepped into the center of history's stage, his footsteps heavy with the promise of empire and faith intertwined. Before Constantine, Christianity was a whispered secret in catacombs and humble gatherings, a faith often hunted, a hope often hidden. But with his rise, the church became a power unlike any before, woven into the very fabric of empire. In 312 A.D., on the eve of battle, Constantine saw a vision, a cross of light emblazoned across the sky. with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether dream or divine, it changed everything. With victory, he granted Christians freedom and favor, ending centuries of persecution. But he also brought the church into a new, delicate dance, a dance of politics, authority, and dogma. Suddenly, faith was no longer only a personal journey, it was a tool of empire. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was the first great act of this new alliance. Bishops convened not only to debate theology, but to forge unity, both spiritual and political, under imperial guidance. Constantine's presence cast a long shadow over the council. His desire for harmony shaped its decisions. The creed that emerged was not just a statement of belief, but a foundation of imperial cohesion. Yet power is a double-edged sword. With the church elevated came new temptations and new dangers. The purity of faith risked being overshadowed by ambition. The boundaries between servant and ruler blurred. Some bishops wielded influence like swords. The line between shepherd and king became faint. The emperor's shadow stretched over sacred halls and sacred hearts. For many believers, this union of throne and altar brought hope, peace after centuries of chaos. But for others, it was a cause for quiet worry. Would the message of humility and love survive in the courts of power, or would it be reshaped to serve ambition? As the empire grew, so did the church's bureaucracy. Orthodoxy was enforced. Dissent was crushed. Heresy became not only a spiritual crime, but a political one. The fires that burned in 325 AD were both literal and symbolic. They consumed not only ancient texts, but old ways of thinking, ways that might have allowed a gentler, more varied faith to flourish. In the wake of empire, Christianity became the official story, the story of kings and councils, of creeds and canons. Yet beneath the grandeur, beneath the gold, some small voices continued to speak softly. Monks in deserts, mystics in caves, women in hidden rooms, they carried on traditions the empire could not command. Faith became, once more, a secret fire kindled in quiet hearts. Tonight, as your breath slows and the world dims, consider this, that even in the cold shadow of empire, the human spirit seeks light, that faith is never just what power tells it to be, and that, sometimes in silence, the truest prayers are whispered. In the quiet corners of ancient libraries, beneath layers of dust and forgotten ink, there once lived a vast constellation of stories, voices that once danced alongside the gospels we know, now lost to time's slow erosion. These were the scrolls that vanished, texts filled with wonder. Doubt, revelation, gospels not included. In the official canon, letters from early believers, hymns of praise, and meditations on the divine mystery. Their absence leaves a haunting question. What truths did they hold that threatened the church's emerging unity? What stories might have reshaped faith as we know it? Among the lost were gospels bearing names like Thomas, Peter, and Mary, not mere biographies, but collections of sayings, spiritual insights, and parables that often veered into the mysterious and mystical. The Gospel of Thomas invites readers to discover the kingdom within, to see the light hidden beneath ordinary life. It whispers that enlightenment is an inward journey, a secret waiting to be unlocked. The Gospel of Peter offers an alternate narrative of the crucifixion and resurrection, one filled with vivid imagery and deep symbolism that differs from the canonical accounts. and the Gospel of Mary challenges the patriarchal structures of the time, elevating the role of women in spiritual leadership and deepening the conversation about salvation and inner knowledge. But the Church, striving for order and control, saw these scrolls as threats text too fluid, too open to interpretation. They were labeled heretical, hidden away, or destroyed. Some say the fires of 325 A.D., both literal and metaphorical, consumed many of these scrolls. Others believe they were deliberately suppressed, locked away in secret vaults, or buried beneath monastic silence. Fragments have been found over centuries, like the Nag Hammadi library discovered in Egypt in 1945, offering glimpses into this lost world. But for every fragment found, many more remain missing. Their loss is a quiet tragedy, a whisper of what could have been. Tonight, as your eyelids grow heavy, imagine these scrolls resting beneath stone, waiting to be found. Their words speak not only of faith, but of the human yearning for meaning, for mystery, for a truth that transcends dogma. And in that imagining, allow yourself to wonder, what if faith were not a fortress to defend, but a garden to explore? What if the divine story is always unfolding in many voices, in many forms? Sleep now, wrapped in the gentle uncertainty of possibility. For even in loss, the soul's search continues, endless and eternal. Long before doctrine hardened and walls were built around belief, there lived a quiet current beneath early Christianity, a hidden stream of thought, gentle yet profound. It was called gnosis, not a creed, not a law, but a knowing, not the knowledge of scholars, but a sacred awareness that pulsed from within, the kind that could not be taught, only remembered. Gnosis was not about learning more, but remembering what the soul already knew before it forgot. For the Gnostics, salvation did not arrive through ritual or submission, but through this awakening, a turning inward, a recognition of the divine spark hidden within the human self. They believed that each of us carried within us a shard of the divine, trapped, veiled, slumbering beneath the weight of the world, and that Christ came not to rescue us from sin, but to awaken us from forgetfulness. In their Gospels, now lost or buried, Jesus was a revealer, not a redeemer. He whispered riddles and parables not to test, but to stir. He did not demand worship. He invited transformation. Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings, the Gospel of Thomas begins, will not taste death. It was a bold claim and a different kind of faith. In this vision, the material world was not the end, but the veil. Life was a labyrinth the soul must journey through, remembering piece by piece what it once knew in fullness. God was not distant, watching from above. God was a mystery within a presence beyond name, waiting to be unveiled. And the enemy? Not evil in the way we often imagine, but ignorance, sleep. Forgetting. To the Gnostic mind, the greatest tragedy was not that we are sinful, but that we are asleep. Awakening was everything. And yet, such beliefs threatened the rising power of institutional religion. Gnosis could not be controlled. It required no priest, no hierarchy, no intermediary. A Gnostic might sit under a tree, alone with their soul, and experience the sacred with no permission needed. This was dangerous, because empire favors certainty, structure, and authority. And gnosis was none of those. It spoke in paradox. It honored silence. It invited seekers to question, even to question, the very God they were told to worship. Gnostic texts often described a flawed world, created not by the true unknowable God, but by a lesser being, the demiurge, a cosmic artisan who mistook himself for the divine. This creator, they believed, fashioned matter, but not spirit. And so the Gnostic Gospels challenged not just church authority, but the very framework of creation. What did it mean, they asked, to live in a world built by illusion? And how do we wake from it? These were not easy questions. They were unsettling, but they were honest and beautiful. Yet in the 4th century the Gnostics were labeled heretics. Their teachings were outlawed, their writings condemned to flame. The gentle knowing they offered was replaced by creeds carved in stone. Still, gnosis did not vanish. It moved underground, into monasteries where some monks copied ancient fragments by lamplight, into mystical orders, into poetry, into whispered stories passed down in secret. And perhaps even now it lingers in moments you cannot explain, the sense of being more than your name, the feeling that some part of you remembers a place you've never been, the light behind the eyes of a stranger, the stillness that feels like coming home. These too are gnosis. Tonight, as you lie quiet beneath the stars, ask nothing, seek nothing. Only listen. Not to me or to history, but to that inner hush, that subtle thread that runs through all things. It may be that the knowing you seek has been waiting inside you all along. Beneath the weight of doctrine and empire, there still flickered voices, faint, stubborn, resolute. They were called heretics, not because they were wicked or deceitful, but because they remembered a different song. They were the quiet dissenters, the mystics and dreamers who refused to let the mystery be reduced to rules. They walked the edges of early Christianity, clinging to gospels no longer read aloud, to truths no longer welcomed at the altar. To believe differently was no longer debate, it was danger. The word heresy comes from the Greek heresis, which once simply meant choice. But by the time of the Church Fathers it had grown sharp. To choose a different belief was no longer a personal path, it was rebellion. And rebellion would not be tolerated. And yet choose they did. Among them was Valentinus, a brilliant theologian. Born in the 2nd century, once so revered he nearly became Bishop of Rome. But his teachings wandered beyond the rising orthodox line. He taught that the divine was a perfect, unknowable fullness, the pleroma from which all creation flowed. He believed the soul was exiled, trapped in matter, aching for return. Christ, for Valentinus, was not simply a sacrifice, but a revealer, a map to the inner journey back to the divine source. His words were poetic, strange, and radiant. Too radiant, perhaps, he was branded a heretic. His writings largely destroyed, but others carried his torch. Basilides in Alexandria taught of a layered heaven, of eons and light, of a Christ who passed through realms to awaken souls one by one. Marcion in Rome boldly rejected the wrathful God of the Hebrew Scriptures, embracing a gospel of love and liberation, even compiling what may have been the first Christian canon, one that looked very different from the one we know today. All of them heretics in the eyes of power, and yet beloved in the hearts of those who followed them. They did not seek to destroy the church. They sought to understand the Christ they knew in dream and silence. To them, faith was not a fortress, it was a flame. They hid in the margins of cities, in hills and desert caves. They copied scrolls in secret. They told parables to their children and sang hymns not found in any official book. And when questioned, when threatened, when summoned before councils, they often chose silence, or exile, or death, not out of stubborn pride, but because they could not betray what had awakened within them. We often imagine heresy as prideful, rebellious, ego-driven. But what if, for many, it was simply honesty? What if they felt something sacred stir inside them and refused to pretend otherwise? What if their questions were not threats, but invitations? Even now, fragments of their thought survive, buried in forgotten codices, echoed in mystic poetry, whispered in the words of visionaries who followed. They remind us that orthodoxy was never the only way, that truth, like light, bends and refracts, changing as it touches different eyes. And they remind us that the cost of clarity can be the silencing of wonder. Tonight, as the world dims and your thoughts grow soft, consider those who hid not to escape truth, but to protect it, who whispered secrets not to divide, but to remember, not. Every heretic was wrong. Some simply saw farther than their age could accept. And even now, long after their names have been buried in dust and disdain, we might still feel the warmth of their flame, quiet, gentle, undeniable. It did not happen all at once. There was no single moment when the Christian Bible was born in full, leather-bound, and final. It was a slow and winding process, unfolding across centuries, shaped not only by inspiration, but by decision, debate, and decree. And by the 4th century, the age of sacred choice was drawing to a close. The word canon means rule, measuring rod. It implies a boundary, what is in and what is out, what is truth and what is trespass. In the early years of Christianity, there was no universal agreement on Scripture. Communities cherished different collections. In Corinth, Paul's letters were passed from hand to hand. In Syria, the Gospel of Thomas was read aloud beside Matthew and Luke. In Egypt, the Gospel of Mary was whispered in circles of spiritual seekers. Each group, each place, each heart holding a slightly different vision of the sacred. But unity, once the faith became official, demanded structure, and structure demanded a book, a closed book. The drive to define the canon intensified after the Council of Nicaea. Theologians and bishops, fueled by a desire for doctrinal clarity, began to sift through the sea of writings that flowed through the early church. There were hundreds, gospels, and apocalypses, acts and epistles, visions and parables, some beautiful, some bizarre, some troubling, some transcendent. Gradually a pattern emerged. Certain texts appeared again and again across regions and traditions. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the letters of Paul, the Psalms of David. Others sparked division. Some were too mystical, some too feminine, some too strange. By the late 4th century, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria, a powerful figure in shaping orthodoxy, issued a festal letter in the year 367 A.D. In it, he listed 27 books he declared to be the only acceptable writings for the New Testament. It was the first time those exact 27 books, no more, no less, were named together The canon was taking shape. Yet even then, disagreement lingered. Some churches still read the Shepherd of Hermas, a deeply spiritual text filled with allegory. Others treasured the Epistle of Barnabas or the Gospel of the Hebrews. Still others doubted Revelation, uneasy with its violent, cryptic visions. But the center held. What followed was not universal agreement, but universal enforcement. With the rise of imperial Christianity, councils solidified Athanasius's list. What was once guidance became mandate. What was once preferred became absolute. The Bible, as we know it, was born, a sacred tapestry of history, poetry, prophecy, and law tied together by the decisions of human hands. This was no simple act of obedience to the divine. It was a curation, a holy archive shaped by spirit, yes, but also by politics, fear, and the need for control. What was left out was as telling as what remained. Gone were the Gnostic Gospels, with their inward light and divine paradox. Gone were the writings of women and the voices of spiritual dissenters. Gone were the dreams too difficult to tame. And yet the Bible that emerged was still beautiful. It holds poetry that aches with longing, stories that wrestle with grief and glory, mysteries that cannot be explained, only felt. But it is not the only path. It is one path. To canonize something is to elevate it, but also to exclude. It is to say this and not that. And so, for every line preserved, another was lost. Tonight, as your body softens into sleep, let yourself imagine a table, not of stone, but of voices, some loud, some quiet, some left without seats. They gathered, not to argue, but to tell what they remembered. A teacher who healed with touch. A woman who saw him first in the garden. A dream of divine fire that burned not to destroy, but to illuminate. Their stories didn't all make the final book, but that does not mean they were not true. In the silence beyond the canon, truth still walks, soft-footed, unwritten, undeniable. Fire has always been a symbol of purification, of renewal, of divine presence. A bush that burns but does not consume. Tongues of flame descending upon apostles. The candle lit in sacred silence. But fire, in the hands of fear, can become something else. It can be used to erase, to silence, to censor. In the centuries following the Council of Nicaea, the fire that once lit the early Christian heart became a weapon used not only against those who disbelieved, but against those who believed differently. Scrolls that once sat side by side, Thomas and Matthew, Mary and John, were now divided not by content, but by permission, and those without permission were cast into flame. Books were ordered destroyed. Gospels deemed apocryphal, meaning hidden, were hunted down and burned. Possession of forbidden writings could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. A line had been drawn, and the smoke from its enforcement darkened the skies of memory. The Church, now allied with the might of the Roman Empire, saw in these texts a threat, not just to theology, but to unity. And unity, they believed, must be preserved at any cost. So the flames were fed. In Alexandria, temples and their libraries were reduced to ash. In Rome and Byzantium, imperial edicts called for the destruction of heretical books. Across the empire, bishops and emperors moved together, reshaping the spiritual landscape not only by what they proclaimed, but by what they destroyed. But fire does not always obey its master, because every book burned is a question left unanswered, a possibility sealed away, a silence that echoes louder than the words themselves. And sometimes someone watches the fire and remembers it is believed that many of the texts discovered at Nag Hammadi, buried in jars beneath the Egyptian sands, were hidden in direct response to these fires, preserved not to defy, but to protect, not in rebellion, but in reverence. Imagine it, a monk quietly gathering scrolls as edicts are read aloud. He knows what they are. He knows what they mean. He wraps them in linen, seals them in clay, and buries them beneath a cliff, hoping, praying that truth might survive the torch, and survive it did. Not whole, not without loss, but alive. Centuries later, the sands would shift, the jars would break, and the flame, once destructive, would give way to a new light, the light of rediscovery. It is easy, from a distance, to condemn the burning, to ask how anyone could destroy words spoken in love or visions written in awe. But fear makes strange things of us all, and history is full of those who believed they were saving truth by narrowing it. And so we inherited a scripture purified by fire but also scarred by it. We walk through a sacred story that was curated with care, but not without cost. The questions we ask today about Jesus, about God, about the soul, might have had more answers, or deeper mysteries, if not for the flames. Yet in the very act of burning, the forbiddens was made unforgettable. It became legend. It became longing. It became the quiet question asked in darkened chapels and midnight studies. What was lost? What was taken from us? What could we have known had we not chosen silence by smoke? Tonight, as you settle into stillness, listen for what the fire could not consume. The memory, the yearning, the ember still glowing beneath the ash, because truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken, and even when written words are turned to smoke, their spirit drifts onward soft as breath, seeking those who will dream them back into life. In the soft flicker of candlelight, amid the silent halls of monasteries and the shaded corners of cloisters, there lived a quiet brotherhood, those who became the custodians of memory. They were monks, scribes, and scholars entrusted with fragile parchment and the fading words of generations past. While the great fires consumed many texts, these guardians moved gently, copying by hand what was deemed worthy and sometimes daring to preserve what was not. In their delicate strokes there was reverence not only for the sacred words, but for the act of remembering itself. These men and women knew that each letter was a bridge between time and truth, between forgotten voices and the future. Their work was slow, intimate, and humbling. Day after day their hands traced ink on vellum, copying scriptures and sometimes hidden fragments that whispered alternate stories. And though many were bound by obedience, some preserved more than the official line. A marginal note here, a carefully hidden phrase, their small rebellions, perhaps, or silent prayers that the lost might be found again. Their libraries, often modest, were sanctuaries of light in a world shadowed by control and conflict. Without their dedication, entire worlds, a thought, would have disappeared without a trace. Yet they rarely sought glory. Their names were forgotten, their lives uncelebrated, but their work endured. They were the quiet witnesses to history's turning tide, Tonight, as the world grows still and your breath slows, imagine their patient hands, their steadfast hearts, their humble devotion to truth's fragile thread, dot in the silence they kept alive. There still flickers a spark waiting to be kindled in your own quiet wonder. Sleep now, wrapped in the gentle legacy of those who guard the stories we almost lost dot in the winter of 1945, not far from the Nile's gentle bend, near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi. Something ancient stirred from its long sleep dot. It was not thunder that announced it, not a shout from mountain tops or the clang of discovery dot. It was a shovel, a soft crack in sun-baked earth, and the curious hands of a farmer named Muhammad al-Salman, digging for fertilizer in the hills. What he found was no ordinary treasure. Beneath the clay was a sealed jar about a meter high, warm from the desert sun, sealed for centuries. Inside it rested 13 leather-bound codices, tightly packed with brittle pages of Coptic script, copied from Greek, and older still in memory dot. They were not known texts, not the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, not Paul's letters, or Psalms or law. They were forbidden books, banished, buried, and forgotten by the world that once feared them dot. It was the Nag Hammadi Library, a collection of Gnostic texts, hidden away sometime in the 4th century, likely by monks who knew what was coming. Among them were scrolls like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, the Tripartite Tractate, and Thunder Perfect Mind, each a window into early Christianity's mystical soul, long left in darkness. These were not books of laws, but of light, not creeds, but cones. They did not offer commandments, they asked questions. They did not proclaim, they invited. They painted a different Christ, still sacred, still central, but not a sacrifice set to appease a wrathful God. He was a revealer, a mirror, a voice that beckons the soul inward. If you bring forth what is within you, the Gospel of Thomas whispers, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. These were the words once feared, because they did not ask you to follow. They asked you to wake dot, to awaken, not just to belief, but to being. Not to doctrine, but to divine awareness. Not to a distant God, but to the divine within. The Gnostics believed that the world was a veil, a half-light, and that Jesus came not to rule it, but to pierce it, so that you might remember that you are more than flesh and fear, that you were made of light and can return to it. These ideas stood in direct contrast to the rising authority of the imperial church dot, and so these texts were banned, their readers condemned, their pages burned. But one small group centuries ago chose a different path. They buried them, wrapped in leather, hidden in stone, entrusted not to time, but to hope that one day the world might be ready to listen again. And listen, we did. When the Nag Hammadi texts were finally translated in the 20th century, the world of biblical scholarship trembled. Here were pieces of Christianity thought lost, if not erased. Here were voices that had been silenced for over 1,600 years. Their presence didn't negate the Bible, but it complicated it, expanded it, enriched it. It reminded us that the early Christian world was not narrow. It was vast, messy, full of dreams and disagreements Visions and poetry. It reminded us that orthodoxy is not the whole of truth, only a chosen shape of it. The Nag Hammadi library reopened questions that had long been closed. Was Mary Magdalene more than a follower, perhaps a spiritual equal? Was salvation a gift or a remembering? Was God a being or a mystery too deep for name? And perhaps most importantly, who decided which voices we were allowed to hear? These texts do not demand answers. They offer doorways. Some are difficult. Some are dazzling. Some are deeply strange. But all are filled with longing for wisdom, for reunion, for light. And now they belong to us again. Not to divide, not to replace, but to remind that buried truths can rise, that forgotten voices can speak again, that the sacred is far too vast for a single telling. Tonight, as you rest under the hush of your own thoughts, picture that desert hill, the jar, buried in clay, the first rays of sun striking words hidden for millennia. A secret finally exhaled. Let it be a comfort that not all truth burns. Some of it waits, sleeps, and then returns exactly when the soul is ready. In the soft shadows of early Christian memory, one figure lingers quietly, her presence felt more in whispers than in words. Mary Magdalene, often called the apostle to the apostles, holds a paradox within her story, celebrated and sidelined, remembered yet forgotten. She was a woman who witnessed the dawn of a new faith, not just a follower, but a bearer of news, the first to see the risen Christ. Yet over centuries her story was shaped, reshaped, and at times silenced. In the canonical Gospels, she appears with strength and sorrow, loyalty and courage. She stands at the cross, she weeps at the tomb. She is the first to speak of resurrection, a sacred messenger in a world that often ignored women's voices, but later tradition painted her differently. As a repentant sinner, a fallen woman, a cautionary tale. This reshaping speaks to a larger truth about the early church, the tension between the mystical and the institutional, between spiritual equality and patriarchal order. In the secret texts of the Nag Hammadi library, Mary Magdalene emerges not as a penitent, but as a visionary and teacher. In the Gospel of Mary, she comforts the disciples after Jesus' departure, sharing insights of profound depth. She holds knowledge that others do not, and yet the other disciples doubt her. This tension reveals an early Christian community wrestling with authority and truth, with faith and fear. Mary is not just a footnote. She is a symbol of the hidden, feminine, the voice that challenges silence. She reminds us that the sacred is not confined to those who wield power, but lives equally in those who listen deeply and speak from the heart. Tonight, as your thoughts drift toward stillness, hold space for Mary Magdalene, the silent apostle. Her story is a gentle call to remember the ones whose light is dimmed, but never extinguished. She invites us to listen beyond the official tale, to seek the sacred in the margins, and to honor the quiet strength within us all. May her courage guide you into dreams, where truth and mystery entwine softly, like a whispered prayer. The year was 312 A.D., a dawn heavy with possibility, draped in the mist of a battlefield near the Milvian Bridge. Here Constantine the Great, soon to be emperor, stood poised between victory and defeat. It is said that on this day a vision came to him, an emblem of light, a cross blazing across the sky. promising triumph if he embraced the Christian God, whether dream or prophecy. This moment changed the course of history. Constantine's embrace of Christianity transformed it from persecuted sect to imperial faith. No longer a whispered secret in darkened catacombs, Christianity became the voice of Rome itself, powerful, official, unstoppable. Yet this union of empire and religion was neither simple nor pure. It was a marriage of convenience and ambition, a weaving of political power with spiritual promise. With Constantine's favor came the Council of Nicaea, the defining moment when doctrine was debated, declared, and dogma forged. The empire demanded unity. The faith demanded clarity. In this crucible, the diverse, fragmented voices of early Christianity were gathered and ordered. The canon began to close. Heresy was named and condemned. The church became both shepherd and sword, but with power came shadows. The flame that had once lit souls became a tool of control. Questions were silenced, mysteries narrowed. The fullness of spiritual experience compressed into a creed. Constantine's legacy is a paradox. He was a bringer of peace for some, a harbinger of constraint for others. His vision gave the church shelter under the imperial roof, but also a cage. Tonight, as your mind drifts softly into rest, consider the weight of this union, how the tides of power shape what stories are told, and which are left untold. In the quiet spaces between faith and empire, between history and myth, lies the gentle invitation to wonder. To ask not only what was gained, but what was lost, and to hold in your heart the mystery that faith, like sleep itself, is not a single journey, but many woven in light and shadow, and silence and song. May this thought cradle you into peaceful dreams. As night deepens and the world grows still, we return to the gentle glow of memory, the embers of a story that stretches across centuries. What truth did the church burn in 325 AD? Perhaps it was not a single secret, but a tapestry of voices, visions, and questions woven in shadow and light. The flames did not merely consume words. They shaped what would live and what would rest in silence. Yet even in ashes the soul of the forgotten lingers. In hidden libraries, in whispered prayers, in the sacred heartbeat of those who dared to remember differently. The story is not only of loss, but of resilience, of texts buried but never erased, of seekers who held truth like a fragile flame, passing it from hand to hand across the quiet centuries. Tonight, as you lay your head down, breathe in the mystery that truth is never truly lost. It shifts, it hides, it waits patiently, like embers beneath cold ash, ready to glow again when the time is right. May you rest knowing that in the vast night of history, the light of curiosity and wonder is eternal. That every question whispered in the dark is a candle lit against forgetting. And that the deepest truths, those that dwell quietly in the soul, are always within reach, shimmering softly beneath the surface. Sleep now, cradled by the soft hum of stories told and untold, held safe in the timeless embrace of memory's gentle flame. Good night. In the early centuries of Christianity, the boundaries of belief were not yet drawn in stone. Truth and heresy danced a delicate waltz, their steps uncertain, shifting with time. Orthodoxy, the right belief, was still finding its shape as competing ideas wove through the minds and hearts of believers. The council halls echoed with debate, The air thick with passion and fear. To declare one truth was to condemn another. To define faith was to veil mystery. The Church, emerging as an institution, faced a difficult task: to unify a sprawling and diverse community under a single banner. In this task, the line between preservation and suppression blurred. Text deemed threatening, too mystical, too radical, too questioning, were set aside, hidden away, or destroyed. This was not merely an act of control, but of survival. For a faith spread through a fractured empire needed cohesion to endure. Yet the cost was great. The veil of orthodoxy covered vast realms of thought, stories, and spiritual paths that might have illuminated the human soul in ways lost to us now. In the quiet shadow of this veil, the seekers, the mystics, the dissenters kept alive alternative visions. They whispered of divine sparks within, of knowledge, as salvation, of a God beyond comprehension. Tonight, as the world softens and your breath slows, imagine the vast, unseen spiritual landscape beyond the veil, the hidden scriptures, the whispered prayers, the faiths that almost were. Let the mystery of the unknown lull you gently toward sleep, for in the dark between certainty and doubt lies the quiet wonder that keeps the heart open and the soul awake. In the waning light of the ancient world, there lived a woman whose mind shone brighter than the lamps that lit Alexandria's streets. Her name was Hypatia, philosopher, mathematician, teacher, and last guardian of the great library's fading spirit. She was not a Christian, nor an enemy of Christians. She was a seeker of knowledge, of harmony, of understanding, in a time that had begun to fear such things. Alexandria, once a sanctuary of many beliefs, was now caught in a storm. The tides of power had shifted. The old gods were falling. The Church had risen wounded from persecution, yet now wielding the blade of imperial favor. And in that fragile moment between epochs, intolerance grew. Hypatia taught openly of Plato, of geometry, of the cosmos, and the divine order she believed echoed in every number, every star. She welcomed students from all faiths. She wrote letters to bishops and debated scholars. Her fame was not merely of intellect, but of grace. To many, she was a living emblem of ancient wisdom, but to some, she was a symbol of the past that refused to die. And symbols are dangerous when empires are insecure. In 415 A.D., as religious tensions boiled over in Alexandria, Hypatia became a target, a mob fueled by zealotry, stoked by whispers of political rivalry. Found her in the street. They dragged her from her chariot. They brought her to a church, and there, within sacred walls, they ended her life not with swords, but with tiles and shards. They tore knowledge from the world with their hands. It was not only Hypatia they silenced. It was an age, a bridge, a vision of the sacred that could coexist with reason. And with her passing, the last flame of Alexandria's ancient wisdom dimmed. The library, already wounded by past fires, would never fully rise again. The dream of a world where inquiry was devotion, where thought was worship, faded into shadow. Yet still Hypatia's name endures. In every quiet scholar, every bold teacher, every woman who speaks in a room taught to silence her, she lives on. She is not a martyr of war or religion. She is a martyr of memory. Her death was not just a killing. It was an erasure of possibility. But her legacy is a resurrection of it. Tonight, as the hush of sleep gathers around you, Picture her in her study, pen in hand, scrolls unrolled across a marble table. Listen for her voice, not loud, not bitter, just clear and wise, and still willing to teach. Let that voice guide you into dreams, for what was burned can still be remembered, and what was torn away can still grow again, if we are quiet enough to listen. Beyond the grand councils and blazing fires, beyond the proclamations and proclamations of faith, there existed another world, quiet, hidden, and enduring dot in the shadows of monasteries and the dust of ancient vaults. Silent codices rested. They were fragile books, often handwritten on delicate parchment, their words barely visible beneath layers of time. These codices carried the whispers of those who did not fit. The official story mystics, heretics, seekers of light and knowledge in forms the church could not accept. Some spoke of a divine feminine, others of secret knowledge passed from teacher to chosen pupil. Some offered prayers not of supplication, but of awakening, hymns that hummed with cosmic mystery. These books were passed from hand to hand, sometimes hidden behind false pages, sometimes buried beneath stone floors. Their guardians were often humble monks, scholars whose hearts held both obedience and quiet rebellion. They understood that the power of these texts was not only in their words, but in their very survival. Each page preserved was a small act of defiance against forgetting. Across centuries, these codices bore witness to a faith less certain, more fluid, and richly complex. They remind us that truth is not a single voice, but a choir many harmonies blending, sometimes discordant, but always alive. Tonight, as you settle into sleep's embrace, imagine those silent codices resting quietly in shadowed shelves. Imagine the gentle hands that turned their pages in whispered reverence. Long after the fires burned out, let their quiet endurance be a lullaby to your soul. For in the silence of forgotten voices, there is a soft, persistent light waiting to be found once more dot in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world is still and the stars seem to lean closer. There is a space where the forgotten stirs. This is not the hour of certainty. It is the hour of listening dot to the soft turning of memory, to the ancient breath of stories almost lost, to the truth that was once whispered and then silenced, and that now dares to whisper again. We began this journey in the year 325 A.D., at the Council of Nicaea, a moment when the Church, newly entangled with empire, sealed its truth with fire. And decreed and along the way, we've wandered through desert scrolls and forbidden gospels, mystics and martyrs, poets and prophets, seekers and saints. We've watched truth narrowed, voices erased, and yet miraculously somehow, through centuries of silence, the light remained. Because truth, you see, is stubborn. It does not vanish when banned. It does not perish when burned. It drifts. It waits. It buries itself in jars beneath the sand or lingers in the margins of old manuscripts. It hides in hearts brave enough to remember the Nag Hammadi texts sealed in clay by hands who knew what was coming. The Gospel of Mary, where a woman becomes the voice of insight. The Gospel of Thomas, where the kingdom is found not above, but within. These are not just old writings. They are echoes. They are invitations. They are reminders that faith was once wide like the sky, unwritten, untamed, alive dot, and while power tried to shape that faith into a fortress, still the garden remained dot. So what? then, did the church burn in 325 A.D. Yes, it burned texts. Yes, it buried teachings. Yes, it narrowed what could be spoken. But more than that, it burned possibility. The possibility that salvation might be inward, not inherited. The possibility that women could be leaders of soul and spirit. The possibility that Christ came not to demand belief but to awaken light. And yet the flame did not die dot in the rhythm of monks' quills, in the memory of seekers exiled by creed, in the desert caves and in the hearts of the curious even now. That flame, that whisper, that candle in the dark, still flickers. You carry it to dot because to wonder is to remember. To question is to honor. To dream is to awaken. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts soften into sleep, imagine yourself holding a small candle. Its glow is quiet, not blinding. It does not demand, it does not preach. It simply shines. You walk through the corridors of time with it, past the echoing council halls, the ashes of scrolls, the cracked jar and the Egyptian sand, and in the light of that flame you see them, those voices we have followed, a monk slipping a scroll into hiding, a woman standing alone, speaking truth, a teacher offering riddles instead of rules, a philosopher asking questions long before anyone dared to answer. Their voices are not gone. They are simply quieter than the rest. And now you have heard them. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps remembering is the beginning of recovering. Sleep now, with the candle still glowing in the quiet of your heart. Let it keep watch over you, steady and soft, until morning comes. And when it does, may you rise not with all the answers, but with a deeper kind of knowing that truth, when buried, does not die. It waits, it endures, and when we are ready, it returns.